use. That they sold 50% more 2530s than they did Phantom 3s when these things were new. That's a little different from the good days of the earlier Phantom 2s, maybe even the Phantom 1s. By the time this came along, the Phantom was just an awfully big car and wasn't really all that necessary for most people. Our old 2530, which is now Al Briseño's 2530, was used by the original owners to tour all over Europe in the summers. They'd pack the family in that and in a little Chrysler Roadster, and the two sons would drive the Roadster with all the luggage in it, and the family would be packed into the 2530. And they were running down to Lake Como and places like that. And after the war, the second owner toured Switzerland and did pass storming in the Alps with that 2530. So they're practical cars, and especially then, you know, when speeds were lower and traffic wasn't as heavy as it is now. They're really, really strong cars, really good cars. There were, what, 1,201 of them, I think, built, and 700 and something Phantom 3s. They sold a few more Derby Bentleys than they did these. This is awfully comparable to the 4 1/4 Bentley. They bored out the engine to produce the 2530 and the 4 1/4. They took it from 3.5 liters to 4 1/4 and did all kinds of refinements on it. They did on these cars too, like the Borgenbeck clutch, which is a real pleasure. Most of the cars, of course, were bodied by the London coach builders, but a lot were still done in the hinterlands with the provincial coach builders. This car was built by John S. Woolley in Nottingham, about a mile from where my wife grew up, so we feel very partial to Woolley. They were a coach builder that had its roots going back in generations to about 1765. Coach builder started there, and he eventually sold out to a Mr. Sterry, and stayed with the Sterry family until about 1905. One of the Sterrys apprenticed to Hooper's, and he learned a lot of the coach building trade at Hooper. And if you take a look at Sterry's construction and at Woolley's construction, and then look at a Hooper, yeah, there's a fair amount of similarity in there, especially with the ruggedness, I think. Sterry, the elder Sterry, died about 1905, and the company directors and the rest of the family got one of their competitors, Mr. Woolley, in to run the place. Woolley had started in the 1870s. He had lived in Uttoxeter, and then he moved into Nottingham. He was a grocer, and he decided he'd do coach building on the side when he wasn't selling groceries. And he became quite good. Really, really a very good coach builder. And then it went down through the Woolley family. Eventually, they bought out Sterry's in 1921, I think. And so the history starts off on this little chart I prepared with Sterry's Limited, then Sterry and Woolley Limited, which was true until about 1923, and then J.S. and A. Woolley. That was John Woolley and his sons. And then about 1931, he reorganized it yet again, and it just became John S. Woolley Limited. They were up on Park Place and Park Row in Nottingham, and it shows it on this wonderful little badge that's on the dashboard. Park Place is a very nice area up near Nottingham Castle. And the thing about Nottingham is that starting in about 1100, the Normans came in and occupied this big rock, this Castle Hill, and built a castle there. This was the one that was immortalized in Robin Hood. The Sheriff of Nottingham hanging out in the castle and all that. The original castle didn't exactly look like the one in the movie, but it was fairly close. And it eventually was knocked about by Cromwell and fell in, and the Duke of Northumberland built a very elegant Baroque manor house to replace it, which later was burned in the Corn Law riots in 1837 and rebuilt with the city into an art museum, which it is today. But all around the castle was where the Normans lived. The Saxons were down in the bottom. And to this day, The really nicest area of Old Nottingham is up on the hill around the castle, where the Normans were, and everybody else is down there, or in the great surrounding area, because Nottingham is spread like mad. Park Place was the sort of shops area to serve the park, where the customer base was. And Woolley built quite a few Rolls-Royces from about 1908 on, most of which were sold to residents in the park or in other very, very nice residential areas near the park. They maybe supplied 3 or 4 cars to people who didn't live in Nottingham, and that was it. This car had an interesting history. One of the great entrepreneurs in Nottingham was a guy named Sir Julian Kahn. He had inherited 3 small department stores from his father back around the turn of the century. And he came up with the idea of hire purchase, or buying on credit, paying so much a month. Nobody had ever done that in Britain. He introduced it. And by the time he died in 1943, he had over 300 stores all over the country and had made an incredible amount of money, just a disgusting amount of money. He had, I think, 9 Rolls-Royces over the years, and probably 4 of them were built by Woolleys. As they moved into the 30s, he got away from going down to Hooper or Park Ward and went to Woolleys, because they could do just exactly what he wanted. One of the cars that they did for Sir Julian was this extremely elegant Phantom II 50 SK, the late one. Very Art Deco coupe. Unfortunately, that body was thrown away about 50 years ago, and yet another touring replica was put on it. But Sir Julian loved cricket. He was absolutely mad about cricket, and he had the money to pursue his madness in a big way. He formed his own cricket team, toured the world with it by yacht or by liner about every other summer, from maybe 1925 until 38. It was incredible, and it was perhaps the best-known cricket team in the world. He would hire really good cricketers, and in the off-season, he would have them work in his businesses. So he had his stable. One of his stable, the lead batsman, was Mr. Newman, Lofty Newman. Why Lofty? Because when you hit the cricket ball, you loft it up in the air. And Lofty could go higher and farther than most anybody else. He was the great star of the cricket team. And in 37, he decided he needed a new car, so he went to Woolleys. He started off ordering a 4-door saloon and changed the order very quickly, as you can see from the chassis card up there, and produced this. And this is the only coupe that was built by Woolley on the 2530. It was only one of 2 that they built anyway. It is a lovely, lovely little car. Very unusual for being by Woolley. But more than that, it has a lot of really great lines in it. Mr. Woolley used to go down to the London Auto Show and probably to the Paris Show and the Geneva Show and see what the other coach builders were doing and get inspiration from that. All the coach builders did that. They would just hit the shows every year and keep working around and say, well, I like that. Well, they still do it today. They still do it. So Richard Vaughan in the club, who is a designer in Detroit, mainly on interiors, he does the same thing. He'll tell you, too. So there are lines here that you can recognize. This whole back-end treatment is awfully close to Mulliner. It's closer to Mulliner than any other coach built. But it has some little Woolley touches in the way the line sweeps down at the bottom. This spear is straight out of Mulliner. Some of the rest of this is Hooper, but the way this window curves down a little bit is almost Barker, but it's not quite as fully developed as Barker, so that it's streamlined, but it isn't exaggerated. They could do an exaggerated dropping rear, and you'll see a picture over here of 3AX37, which was one of Sir Julian's cars, and he had 2 built at the same time as this car. That one still survives. It's in California, and, excuse me, it needs help. But it has a rear window line, rear quarter window line, drops way down. It looks almost ungainly, but it gave Sir Julian a lot of room to see out, which is what he wanted. So did his kids. Lofty Newman, in case you're interested, was a big guy. He's in this picture. This is Sir Julian's Cricket 11 in 1938. Sir Julian's sitting in the middle, front row, looking quite prosperous and very pleased with himself, as he should be. And next to him, to his right, is Lofty Newman, who had this car. The Newmans, Mr. and Mrs. Newman, had no children, but they did have a large dog. And Sir Julian's son told me about 3 years ago that the Newmans never would go anywhere without the dog. They used to come out to Stanford Hall, where the Khans lived. They'd come out for Sunday tea or something like that. Their families were very close. And they'd always pull up in their latest car. Very frequently this car, and the dog would occupy the entire back seat. If you take a look at the interior, you'll see there's not a lot of space in the back. Once you get in, it's fine, but getting in is a bit of a problem. It's perfect for a large dog. That helps explain how this body got designed. It was designed to meet Lofty Newman's needs. Absolutely. Anyway, Holbrook Mitchell out in California got this car in the late 60s. It was half disassembled, and he was always going to put it back together. We were always getting after him to say, come on, this is a Nottingham car, you got to put this thing together. Well, one day. Eventually, he got a man named John Williams, is that his name?
Williams, or yeah,
who did all this work. And finally, Holbrook said, I'm old, I'm tired, I've spent enough, let's give it to the foundation. So we have it now. And it's almost done. As you see, the fenders are off. They are the same fender line as on the little 2530 saloon that was pictured here, the RN58. So if you want to know what this car is going to look like with the fenders on it, look at those fenders and apply them to this car. The fenders are in the back. They need a lot of help too. But they're there at least. The engine was rebuilt. The running gear was apparently all rebuilt. And it rolls around the parking lot very nicely, but it won't start. We're not quite sure why. But Mr. Williams told us that when Holbrook said, do the engine, he also said, here are the rings and bearings you'll need. I've ordered them, so use those. No reference to what size was needed at all. So Williams put them in, and when we talked to him, he said, well, I've had it running, and it overheats real quickly. We're not quite sure why, but we sort of suspect that perhaps the one of the gaskets in there, like the head gasket, is not correct. That maybe this reproduction head gasket didn't have all the holes drilled in it for the water to flow around in the water jacket. He said, I'm not sure why that is, but it's hard to start and it doesn't run real well, and it overheats, so we never ran it very much. Oh, okay. So what we have now is an engine that won't catch. Well, sometimes when you drag it around with the forklift, you remember that day, it'll go poof, poof, out the holes there where the spark plugs are if you take the spark plugs off. But will it catch fire and run? No. So, the object lesson today is to figure out what is wrong with this engine. Tim is starting to get down with the object being to get the head off.
So the first step I'm going to take is getting the cylinder head off, which will lighten it up a lot so we can spin it around easily and also enable us to get the pistons and rods out. There's a severe amount of tightness in this engine, which we found from pulling it around.
We did.
And in talking with the fellow, it seemed like he fit the connecting rods too tight, is what it seems like. So we need to do something to correct that.
Single head or two heads?
It's a single head.
Yeah.
So the first thing in doing is after your rocker cover's off is to remove your rockers. And just to let everybody know, this is a pretty relaxed environment. So, if you want to get up and look and see or do whatever you got to do, feel free.
Yeah. If you want to grab questions,
a wrench, Or even help, yes. So anyway, in taking the rockers off, the first thing I like to check are these pads, and these are the areas that contact the top of the valve. And an indent will wear there. You can see it sort of starting there now. Well, it can get to the point where you can't get a proper valve adjustment. Because if you put a feeler gauge in there, you're going to hit the high spots and not the low spot, so then you have a wide gap there. So in doing any sort of engine rebuilding or anything, you want to have these resurfaced. A machine shop normally has a little jig or tool or something that can give you back that profile.
Do they reheat them when reheat treat them when they cut them, or they don't? Touch
These
them?
are probably not all that hard, and also you're probably not going to go below the surface of the hardness. So I wouldn't risk retreating them unless you really had to take a lot off. And in some cases, I've seen it where people have made attempts to rebuild these up with anything from brazing to TIG welding or whatever, and then you open up a whole other can of worms. And another thing to keep in mind is you'll see a tiny little oil hole on the ends of these, and a lot of times there's a little plug in there that's wasn't really intended to be taken out, but what they did was they put a little thing of felt in there because they were trying to control the amount of oil that's going to come out of this. So if it's a little bit plugged up or whatever, then you got to clean that passageway out, make sure oil flow is going to come out through there. And if you do have a jammed up felt, you might have to dig that out or take this cap out of the end and put a new felt in. And so some people think, well, it's just a rocker shaft, and rockers, what could it need? But, you end up spending quite a few hours and times. You can also have wear from where the rocker was riding on the shaft, which sometimes you need to replace the shaft itself. And in the end, you'll see these screw plugs that have been soldered in place. And if you heat those up and melt the solder away and take these plugs out, then you have a hollow opening throughout the shaft, and then that'll enable you to take out whatever dirt and grime is in there. That a fair amount will build up in there over time.
Is it the plan to do that, to disassemble the shaft and take everything else, take the rubbers off?
It's always a good idea if you're at that stage. One of the things with a situation like this, which is something